All right, let's use this little guy that I got off of Amazon to go through the bony landmarks for the postural analysis. We're not gonna do a postural analysis on this toy. We're just gonna basically kind of highlight the bony landmarks you're looking for when you do one on an actual client. And so we'll skip through that whole first part where you put the plumb line slightly anterior to the front of the lateral malleolus. I'm going to be using a chopstick to point so that my fingers don't get in the way of the body. And so let's just start with the ankle joint. So the first thing you're looking at is the lateral malleolus. And so you look to see if the angle of the ankle joint created by the front of the shin and the lateral border of the foot to be 90 degrees to be neutral. So, I mean, he's definitely got some plantar flexion going on. But moving on, then you move on to the knee. And so that's an easy one for everyone. We all know what the knee is. And you look to see if the plumb line runs slightly anterior, which would be slightly forward of the midline through the knee. And so we would find the greater trochanter, which is this here. And then from that greater trochanter, we would take the plumb line down slightly anterior to the lateral malleolus, and we would be then lining them up to see, does that plumb line run slightly anterior or slightly forward to the midline through the knee? If it's behind the center of the knee, it's flexed. If it's in front of the center of the knee, then it's hyperextended. So let's go on to the hip joint. So from the hip joint, we want to see, so this is the iliac crest. And we want to see if the midpoint of the iliac crest is in line with their greater trochanter. And I just want to highlight, when you do the, when you find the greater trochanter, my teacher trainers, they want you to let's imagine that this person had, meat on their bones and flesh. You actually pinch that area to then find the very center of the greater trochanter when you're doing a postural analysis on an actual person. So you would do that, and then you would find their, let's move his arm out of the way, ASIS, which is the front of the iliac crest, and you would find their PSIS, and then from there, so you'd put a middle finger on their PSIS and on their ASIS, and then use your thumbs to find the midpoint of the iliac crest. And then from the midpoint that you find of the iliac crest, whatever that would be for this skeleton, you're lining that up with their greater trochanter to see if they're in line. And so if the midpoint of the iliac crest is behind the greater trochanter, then they're extended. If it's in front of the greater trochanter, then they're flexed. Okay, so moving on to the pelvis, you go back to that ASIS and PSIS, and you see on a horizontal plane, are they level? And we can allow 10 degrees grace for women. So if it's going forward, then it's an anterior tilt. If it's going back, then it's a posterior tilt. And so if their hips were flexed, they'll probably have an anterior tilt. Extended, they'll probably have a posterior tilt. I said we're not gonna really analyze this actual skeleton, but he's definitely got an anterior tilt going on, if you can see that there. And so then after we do that, then we go over to the other side. And we do the same thing. So we start at the ankle, lateral malleolus, and we're looking to see that joint, the angle of the joint created by the front of the shin and the lateral border of the foot. We're looking for that to be 90 degrees to be neutral. And so then moving on to the knee, well, and I'll just kind of show this is plantar flexion, this is dorsiflexion. So if that angle is small, it's dorsiflexed. If that angle is wide, then that is plantar flexed. So then going up to the knee, Okay, so remember that's an easy bony landmark to find. You're going to go back to that greater trochanter, and you're seeing, if you take the plumb line and have it from the greater trochanter slightly anterior to the lateral malleolus, you're looking to see, does that plumb line run slightly forward of the midline through the knee? If the plumb line is behind the center of the knee, it's flexed. If the plumb line is like quite far in front of the center of the knee, then they're hyperextended. Going on up to the hip joint. So we want to see if the midpoint of the iliac crest, which remember is this guy, we want to see if the midpoint of the iliac crest is in line with the greater trochanter. And so we palpate the ASAS, which is the front, and the PSAS, which is the back. Again, this is where we're using our like index finger or our middle finger and then our thumb, and then we're finding the midpoint between our two fingers with our thumb. And so once you've found that midpoint, line it up with that greater trochanter. And what that's going to tell you is if they are in line, they're neutral. But if the midpoint of the iliac crest is behind the greater trochanter, then they're extended. If the midpoint of the iliac crest is in front of the greater trochanter, then they're flexed. So going to the pelvis, after you look at the hip joints, then you palpate the ASAS and the PSAS. You compare them on a horizontal plane to see if they're in alignment. Again, we can allow for 10 degrees for women. So if the pelvis is going forward, it's an anterior tilt, which our skeleton has. If it's going backward, it's a posterior tilt. And so then after you've done their basically ankle to hip, then you're going to look at their spine. And so we'll just we'll give them a slightly angle. We'll move them around a little bit. So we want to see, and again, you're starting from the bottom. So the lumbar spine is the low part of your back, right? Your low back is your lumbar spine. And so we look to see if the curvature of L1 to L5 is flat or if it is anterior convex, which is what we want to see. And so this little guy's doing great. He's got an anterior convex curve. It's a little weird because of how he's situated there. So maybe a little bit of lordosis there, which is an increased curve anteriorly. So he's got excessive extension going on maybe. If it was like more flat, he would be more flat. That's a decreased convex curve anteriorly. And so once you're done with the lumbar spine, then you move up to the lower thoracic region. And so here you're hoping for a posterior convex curve. And so you feel from T6 to T12, and if there's a decreased convex curve posteriorly, then they're flat. If there's an increased convex curve posteriorly, then there's excessive flexion. And so then the upper thoracic, you're looking from T1 to T6, and from the upper thoracic, then you're going to be going on to the cervical spine. So for the cervical spine, there's C1 to C7. And you want to see an anterior convex curve of the neck. He's got a little bit of flatness going on. So ideally this should be scooped in a little bit more than it is. And so a decreased curve anteriorly means flat. An increased convex curve anteriorly means excessive extension. And so, you know, from the side view also for the postural analysis, you're checking to see, is that plumb line, you know, going through the center of those bony landmarks, or is the head forward, ribs forward, pelvis forward, knees? So that's something else that you're looking at, but we're just looking at bony landmarks today to make sure that you know what the lateral malleolus is, the greater trochanter, the ASIS, the PSIS, iliac crest. We've got the acromion process up here. So we've looked at both sides. We've taken a look at his spine, and let's get his arms down. Okay. I think the front's like less necessary here, but basically we're starting off with the feet, and we want to see if there's any supination or pronation. And so, you know, we're looking to see if the middle of the foot is lifted or if they're like rolling onto the outside of the foot. If they were, I'm exaggerating, if they were like that, then he's supinated. But if the outside of the foot is lifted, okay, and they're rolling with their weight onto the inside of the foot, then they're pronated. I hope that, you know, is kind of evident to see what's going on there. So then taking a look, we'll try to straighten them out. Try to make them look a little neutral. So then from there, we ask them to stand with their feet together. He's not the best example, but when they stand with their feet together, we're looking to see the hip, knee, and ankle alignment. We're making sure that they're neutral. So if their ankles and knees are touching, they're neutral. If they're overly together and turning in, then they're knock-kneed. If their knees aren't touching, then they're bow-legged. So like, you know, he'd be considered bow-legged, but that's okay. So then from there, moving on to the pelvis, we look to see if there's any elevation, rotation. So we palpate both ASIS and we compare them, and we put our hands flat on top of their iliac crest on both sides. And from there, we're looking to see if there's any elevation. So they should ideally be level with one another. And then from like above, you're gonna get in their personal space and you're gonna look from above, holding on to each ASIS to see if there's any rotation one way or the other. So, you know, from here, you're either saying they're level, or you're saying, you know, the right side looks elevated compared to the left side. As far as rotation, if he was turning to his left, then that would be a counterclockwise rotation. If he was turning towards his right, which he's not really turning, then that's a clockwise rotation. And so then moving on to his rib cage, okay, from here, we palpate the ASIS and the like lowest rib. So basically I've got my thumb here, my index finger here, okay, on both sides of his body. And we're looking to see if there's any elevation, rotation, or shifting. And we can also tell about the shifting based on like the gap between their arm and their rib cage. And so to me, he looks like he's turning to his left, which would be a counterclockwise rotation. And he looks like he's shifted a bit to his left because it looks like there's a bigger gap here than there is on this side, just looking between the rib cage and the arm. So that's really helpful. And we want to look at their sternum to also see about that rotation. Is that sternum dead on to us, or is it slightly turned in one direction or the other? And so he's got some shifting going on, he's got some rotation going on, and I think as far as elevation or being level, maybe this side is elevated a little more than this side. So beyond the rib cage, then you're gonna go up to the shoulders. And so from here, you palpate along the clavicle, which is this, okay, to the acromion process. And so once you get to the acromion, you're going to have, sorry, I keep bumping the camera, you're gonna have, you know, an index finger here and an index finger here. and you're looking to see if there's any elevation or depression, or if they're in line, then they're neutral. And you will be able to confirm your findings there when you turn them around and do the back. And so then you finish off with their head, and you look to see, as far as the alignment of their cranium on the cervical spine, is there rotation, tilting, or shifting? And I mean, he's definitely tilted down. He's a little bit counterclockwise rotated. Maybe he's shifted a little to his right, okay? So his chin's tucked, he's facing that way. And yeah, so beyond that, let's turn him around. Okay, backside. All right, so from here, again, you start at the feet, so you're gonna have them walk in place, and you're checking to see if there's supination, which is when the middle of the foot is lifted and they're rolling on the outside edge of the foot. Pronation, which is where the outside of the foot is lifted and they're rolling to the inside of their foot. See, like this definitely looks like it's pronated. But if it was like that, then I'm like, ooh, whoa, he's supinated. So from there, you're gonna go to the femurs, and you wanna palpate the femoral condyles, okay? So femoral condyles, and you're looking to see if there's a medial or lateral rotation. So basically, like, if the condyles turn out, then it's laterally rotated. If there's medial rotation, then the front is like facing inside, right? Most people are medially rotated at the femoral condyle there. So then going up to the pelvis, you're gonna palpate the PSIS to see if there's any elevation or rotation. And so you also put your hands on their iliac crest. Again, flat hand situation on both, and you see if they're level. And then you're also looking, you know, is there clockwise or counterclockwise rotation here? From here, you're gonna go to the scapula. And I wanna bring that closer for a better look of what we've got here. So for the scapula, you're gonna first check to see if there's any protraction or retraction. So you would measure 3 fingers against their 3 fingers, and that way you have a gauge of, you know, are you guys the same size, or do you need to factor in a little bit more space between, because you're going to be putting your hand to see on the medial border of their scapula and then between the spinous process. So let's imagine that this chopstick is, you know, a finger, okay? How many fingers are between this medial border and the spinous process? And from there, you're able to gauge. So if it's about 3 or 4 fingers, then it's typically neutral, right? And then if there's a pretty big gap, then they're protracted. If there's not much of a gap, if this space is pretty small, then they're retracted. So checking for elevation and depression, you're gonna have them nod their head forward so that you can find their C7, and then you go down to find T2. And from T2, you wanna see that the superior angle of the scapula, so that means the top, so it is the top of the scapula in line with T2 on both sides. You're gonna check both sides. And if T2 is in line with the superior angle of the scapula, then they're level. But let's say this one's like way up here, well, then it's elevated. So you're checking T2 to see that it matches the superior angle of the scapula. So then besides that, you're gonna look to see about upward or downward rotation. So you're looking to see, is the superior angle and the inferior angle in line? And so this one can be tricky for some people. So if there's upward rotation, that means the top angle of the scapula is going inwards and the inferior or the bottom angle of the scapula is going outwards. If there's downward rotation, then the bottom of the angle is going in and the top angle is going out. And so for this dude, I would say he's definitely got some upward rotation going on because the top angle of his scapula is going inward and the bottom angle is going a bit outward, right? So these two aren't in line with one another. This is a bit outward. So then we're gonna look about winging. So if we, kind of hard to see with him, like it's pretty obvious if there's winging typically. And you're also looking to see if there's anterior tipping. So winging, like, can you fit some, on a person that you're looking at, can you fit some fingers underneath their scapula? If so, there's definitely some winging. Anterior tipping is when this bottom part of the scapula tips off the rib cage. So it's like if there was like a pretty big gap between this and the rib cage. And some people refer to that as it's got this gargoyle type look. That would be anterior tipping. So then moving on to the humeri, which is just your elbow joint. And so you're looking, and most people, see if I can move him. Yeah. Most people are like this. They are medially rotated because of technology. So that means the elbows are facing away from the body. Neutral would be if they're facing quite forward. And then I don't know he won't even go laterally rotated. But most people you're gonna find are medially rotated when you take a look at their humeri. And so then beyond that, you're gonna go through the sequencing of the spine to make sure that there's not any flat areas or imbalances. So this is where you have them do the chin nod and roll down. So I hope that was helpful. Please comment below if there's anything else you'd like to see as far as future videos, or if you need clarification on what we went over today with these bony landmarks. Like the video and subscribe, and I will see you next time.